Good afternoon, everyone. I see we have a good few attendees already joined, so we're going to kick off. Welcome to Milliman's first virtual lunchtime briefing for the Isle of Man. Although a number of my colleagues that are involved in this have gone through this process before, it's my first time, so any mess ups in organisation will be down to me and me alone. Despite the fact that we've pretty much finished lockdown here in the Isle of Man, I expect we'll be doing a few more of these style briefings before international travel becomes commonplace again. So I hope it goes well, and I hope you get something interesting from it. We've got two excellent presentations for you today, as advertised. Bear with me for a moment. First of all, Eamon will be taking you through our practical learnings on developing recovery plans, and we've tried to keep this session as practical as possible. Hopefully it'll be of some value to any of you tasked with producing your own plans in the near future, and certainly once the new corporate governance requirements come in at the end of the year. And if you need more help on doing it, you know where we are. When Eamon finishes, Joe will take us through a number of case studies of actuarial systems, coming from a slightly different aspect to the actuarial staples of Profit and Excel, so it's a different perspective on it. We'll have some time for presentations. We have some time for questions after the presentations. So if you could submit any of your questions using the Q&A facility within Teams. We've left the Q&A timing a little open-ended. We'll continue while we have a discussion, but aim to finish at the very latest by 1:15. And now over to Eamon.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, I'm just trying to advance the slides. There we go. Okay, as Rob mentioned, I'm going to bring you through some of the practical challenges and solutions to those challenges that we've encountered while working with clients on recovery planning. Before getting into the detail on that, though, I'm going to very briefly just remind you of the new requirements as they apply, or as they are planned to apply to Isle of Man insurers. And also just talk a little bit about what a number of different regulatory authorities see as being the required contents of recovery plans. So first to the new Isle of Man requirements, which originally were due to come into force today, but pushed back until the end of the year. A number of changes have been made that relate to recovery planning, and really boils down now to a situation in which insurers need to fully understand the exposures that they have to scenarios that can lead to the need for recovery options. So scenarios that and instances that can get a company into financial difficulty, and the options that they have available to them in order to recover from those sorts of situations. Not only that, companies also need to understand, well, which of those options are actually possible and they would actually intend to implement. So moving from the theory maybe more to the reality of the actual feasible options that are available. It'll be the responsibility of boards to review this plan at least on an annual basis. And it's just interesting to note the regulator has specified that the recovery plan needs to be a properly considered approach. Now, there's maybe not a lot of detail as to what exactly properly considered might mean. But when we look now in a couple of moments at what other regulators have said around the contents of recovery plans, I think that will shed quite a lot of light on what it might mean. So looking then to recovery plan contents, some useful background here from the IAIS. I also have something from EIOPA, which we'll look at in a moment. But the IAIS sees basically three key elements to a recovery plan. Firstly, that there are credible options there to deal with a range of different scenarios, both scenarios that affect just the undertaking itself and those that are more market-wide in nature. Scenarios need to address both capital shortfalls and liquidity pressures, so we can't just look at the capital position of the firm and concern ourselves with that. We also need to look at the liquidity position. And there needs to be a process in place to ensure that any recovery options can be implemented in a timely manner, because obviously options that take too long to implement aren't really going to be very effective. On the contents of the recovery plan, I won't go through each of these in detail, but just draw your attention to the quote below from the IAIS, that the core of the recovery plan is the menu of options available. So those options can range from raising capital or funding, for instance, improving liquidity position, reducing costs, enhancing risk mitigation within the firm, whatever it is that is needed in order to recover the situation. But the firm focus needs to be on the recovery options and not on other aspects. EIOPA has published twice on the topic of recovery planning. Back in 2017, it published an opinion on recovery and resolution frameworks across Europe, and more recently, as part of the Solvency 2020 review, has also outlined what should be included in recovery plans. Again, I won't go into the details here, but I do just want to highlight a couple of them. One being that we need to consider the feasibility of recovery options in a stress scenario. So it's not enough just to have an idea of what type of recovery option we might pursue in a given scenario. We need to be comfortable that it is actually a feasible option. And secondly, we need to look at any preparatory actions that we might need to take in order to facilitate the implementation of that action, and that it can be implemented then in both a timely and an effective manner. As recently as last week, the Central Bank in Ireland has communicated to industry in relation to recovery plans in its consultation paper 131. It's basically running to about 40 pages or thereabouts to set out planned new regulations to come into force in Ireland next year, and a set of guidelines on how the regulator sees that industry should interpret those regulations. A lot of these regulations echo exactly what has been communicated in the past by the IAIS and by EIOPA, although they do get into quite a lot of detail and certainly give a lot of colour around specific regulatory expectations. In common with plans for the Isle of Man, it'll be necessary to review recovery plans at least annually. The board will be charged with the responsibility for assessing and approving the plan. And there will be a need to confirm any reviews that have taken place. So if internal audit, for instance, or external audit through the risk committee has approved, reviewed the plans, that needs to be communicated within the plan itself. There's a lot of detail after being provided as well through the regulations on exactly what should be included in the plan itself. Again, I won't get into each of these in detail, but it's certainly worth reaching for a copy of that consultation paper if you haven't seen it already, just to get a flavour for the level of detail that the regulator is expecting, as this might give some clues as to what might ultimately be expected in the Isle of Man. But if we look at, for instance, the recovery options section of the recovery plan, it's not enough to just include the recovery options themselves here, but we also need to look at a detailed impact assessment for the recovery options as applicable in different adverse scenarios for the company, and also to document the assumptions that have been used in coming up with that impact assessment. We also need to carry out a feasibility assessment of each of the options, particularly to ensure that they can be implemented in a timely manner and that they are actually effective at addressing what might have actually gone wrong at the company. We also need to look at the ability of the company to continue operating effectively through the implementation of the recovery plan. So that's quite an in-depth piece of work, and that's just in relation to recovery options. There are other aspects, say around recovery indicators, the trigger framework for recognizing when the recovery plan needs to be implemented, and so on. So there's further flavour given in the draft guidelines for what's required under these headings. So the recovery plan needs to be linked to the insurer's system of governance, to its ERM framework, and into the ORSA process. There's certain allowance that can be made for the nature and scale and complexity of the insurer, although the company's systemic importance also needs to be borne in mind when looking at the whole question of proportionality. The regulators also pointed out that insurers can't just rely on group recovery plans, but also need to look at their own individual circumstances in detail. So I think that maybe gives us some hints to what properly considered might mean in the context of the Isle of Man's plans. Credibility and feasibility really of the recovery options, they're the cornerstone items that we need to keep in mind, I think. And the factors that might influence an option's feasibility include the past experience of the company or of peer companies that have implemented similar measures in the past, estimates of the timeframes for implementing those recovery options, and then any potential risks or impediments that can be addressed in advance in order to ensure that recovery options can be implemented as quickly as they're needed. So this goes back to the IAIS quote that I mentioned earlier, that the core of the recovery plan is the menu of options. So now coming to the practical challenges that we've encountered in working with our clients on recovery planning, bearing in mind that recovery planning isn't a formal regulatory requirement in Ireland as of yet, although it is due to become a formal requirement next year. So obtaining buy-in from stakeholders certainly was a little more challenging when it in the absence of a specific regulatory requirement, although as we'll see in a minute, and I have a slide going through each of these in more detail, there are other aspects of buy-in that are still challenging. Defining the scope of the recovery plan, so where does recovery planning meet resolution planning? Can we make sure that the recovery planning conversation is broad enough to capture all aspects of what's needed for a recovery plan? Spending too much time on the scenarios that get you into trouble and not enough time on the options that get you out of trouble. Again, maybe if you're too successful in that regard, you might end up with a very long list of recovery options and then struggle to actually turn that into a shorter, more focused list. Assessing the feasibility of options in times of stress as opposed to under normal conditions, and that's can be quite a challenge to do that, as we'll see in a couple of minutes. Quantifying the potential impact of recovery options. Again, there seems to be mounting regulatory expectation around what companies need to do in that regard. And defining the point at which action will be taken. So at what point do you reach for your recovery plan and start moving through the menu of options? So looking at the first challenge and obtaining buy-in from stakeholders, a common issue that we come across is people just not really taking the adverse scenario seriously. So starting from a point that, you know, surely nothing could possibly go wrong with the undertaking. And in not taking that question seriously, people don't really seriously think about the recovery options that are available. And also the question, does recovery planning add any value? Again, if people don't see this as a value-adding exercise, they tend not to put enough effort into it. So we found if we start from the premise that a recovery is needed, that a breach has already occurred, well then that removes any kind of an optimism bias that a problem couldn't actually arise, because we put ourselves into the position where the problem has happened. If we point to past failures of insurers, we can learn quite a bit from what it is that has actually caused those failures. And it also opens people's eyes to the number of failures and near misses that are out there. Pointing to examples of how recovery planning can add value, and that directly addresses the kind of open question around, well, does it add any value? Should I spend any time on it? We found, for instance, examples where we're working through recovery plans, and an option might be to get a capital injection from a shareholder, only to find when looking at that in detail, there are a number of impediments there to actually being able to get approval for that capital and to get it into the company, particularly in a timely manner. And going through that exercise has allowed us to iron out those wrinkles and to make it much more feasible to get capital if and when it might be needed. It can also help to dispel some myths that might be out there. Again, we had another client whose sort of general fallback plan was, well, I'll monetize the VIF if I need access to liquidity, and if I want to maybe reduce the capital requirement of the company at the same time. But when looking at it in a bit more detail, it became apparent that the amount of VIF that the company was prepared, in fact able to monetize, wasn't sufficient to get competitive quotes in the market. So pointing to any clear regulatory expectations in the area of recovery planning is also really useful in overcoming any initial resistance to engagement. Defining the scope then of the recovery plan. So we certainly find that it can be difficult sometimes just to get people to focus on exactly what it is that we mean. We're not looking at sort of tipping points beyond which a company just can't be saved, because we're then into resolution type discussions. We have found, though, in preparing recovery plans, sometimes the regulator has actually asked us to address aspects that stray into resolution, but it is important to try to keep the focus just on the recovery aspects, and not just to focus on possible breaches of capital requirements, but also to spend enough time looking at liquidity issues, because they're certainly front and center when it comes to recovery planning and can be quite important for certain insurers. As well as that, operational continuity. From Central Bank of Ireland perspective, it's become quite an integral part of what they're expecting in recovery plans. So the ability of the company to operate effectively through the implementation of a recovery option and getting back from a crisis situation to BAU. And that needs to be fully fleshed out within the recovery plan. So obviously achieving all that can be challenging, but obviously can also be addressed by getting the right people in the room when coming up with the recovery plan. So spending too much time on the scenarios themselves and not enough time on the solutions effectively goes against what the IAIS initially set out around its expectations. So that the menu of options is the core of the plan itself. Again, we find that it's useful maybe just to get a little bit beyond the scenarios. So start with a situation in which, say, a breach of solvency requirements or a breach of comfortable liquidity levels has already occurred. Now, what are the options that are going to get us out of that situation? What sort of actions can we take? And are any actions needed in order to facilitate those particular recovery actions? So, for example, if we're looking at a situation where we're trying to implement expense savings or restructuring of the company, do we need to do something like set up a shared services platform in order to achieve that sort of outsourcing, and how much time is needed on that? What sort of governance process is needed around it? So we basically need to go through all of the possible options that are available to us, and then figure out what needs to be done in order to facilitate each of those options. That in itself, though, can lead us to a further problem. So we can end up in a situation where we know the full menu of recovery options, but now we've just got a really long list. We don't really know a lot about the feasibility of each of them. And that's where we need to go ahead and do quite a bit of digging in order to conduct some research to see, well, can, for example, reinsurance be gotten? Can it be found at an acceptable price? Are we okay with the counterparty exposures or any other risks that are introduced by it? Is it possible to restructure the company? In what ways could it be restructured when it comes to getting equity capital? Is the shareholder willing and able to provide that capital? Can it provide it when it's needed? So the company may need to seek expertise either from other areas within the firm, within the group, or externally. It's and I don't have a definitive list here, but this is just really to give a flavour for what a complete menu of options might look like. It's very important to pay attention, though, to which options we can actually implement during a stress scenario. That brings me to the next challenge, which we've come across, which is assessing the actual feasibility of options under stress. So this can be a very different exercise to looking at things under normal conditions. If, for instance, we're going to go for reinsurance, can we still get reinsurance quotes if there's a huge economic downturn? What about the counterparty strength of the reinsurer? Are we as a firm actually willing to engage with that counterparty if there's a macro-induced stress? If we're looking at turning, say, to the markets to do some hedging using derivatives, would there be sufficient liquidity in the market in order to do that? If our risk profile as a firm is quite aligned with the risk profile of the parent, and there's a specific scenario that affects both the company itself and the parent in the same way and at the same time, can the parent actually provide capital if we were planning to turn to the parent for financial support? And there are many other examples, like, for instance, if repricing is an option that has been seriously considered, if we're in a scenario that affects just the company itself as opposed to a broader industry-based adverse event, will repricing new business or changing the charging structure on the back book actually be possible given the competitive environment? Quantifying the potential impact then of recovery options, this can be quite involved. Certainly very resource intensive, might need a fair bit of input from your modelling team. But obviously the more granular you can get here, the better understanding you'll have of the various recovery options that are on the table. So companies really need to take a proportionate approach to document why they've done what they've done, to document the assumptions that they've used, to get relevant expertise in order to help them to quantify these impacts. What I've just set out here a couple of examples that look at the impact on the solvency position, but there are lots of other impacts that need to be considered, such as impact on liquidity, on profitability, on say the operational continuity of the company, credit ratings, if applicable, many different facets to the understanding the potential impact of recovery options. But it is certainly one that requires quite a bit of work, quite a bit of detail, and as you'll have seen from the expectations of the central bank in Ireland, there's there's quite a high hurdle to clearing. Finally then, was looking at defining the point at which action would be taken. Again, this can be quite a challenge for companies. So you'll have your trigger framework in place, looking at maybe quite a range of different triggers. Could be aligned with existing KRI frameworks or with risk appetite reporting, maybe slightly separate framework just looking at recovery. The company needs to understand its scenarios, the scenarios in which it could get into difficulty. So systemic scenarios and idiosyncratic scenarios, and perhaps even a combination of the two. Whether or not these scenarios develop very quickly or very slow moving over time, and being able to recognize when one of these scenarios is in the making. So getting that good and common understanding of the early warnings is vitally important, so that recovery options can be put into action in a timely manner. Of course, it's very important to leave scope here for judgment though too, and not just to be tied to the numbers. So we could have, for example, quite a volatile situation where there are short-term fluctuations in equity markets or in interest rates. Our trigger framework might be flashing red for a couple of our risk indicators. But if we expect that in a short space of time things are going to settle down again, we wouldn't necessarily want to be in a situation where we had triggered a capital injection from a shareholder only to find a couple of weeks later that we didn't actually need that capital. And now we're faced with the challenge of getting the capital back to the shareholder, which can be quite difficult, say if the company doesn't have distributable earnings or needs any kind of regulatory approval in order to do that. So certainly not jumping the gun, I think, is of key importance, but balancing that with making sure that you don't just sit around too long and watch the company slip into a very poor financial state. So that's really it for me at the moment in relation to recovery planning. I think we're going to take questions later on. With that, I'm going to pass you across to Joe, who's going to look at an actuarial modelling case study.
Okay, thanks, Eamon, and good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'm going to spend the next 25 minutes or so just sharing some of our experiences of upgrading actuarial models using Python. And what we're seeing a lot of recently in industry is more and more insurers having developed models in Python, and this can be a range of building new models from scratch, migrating existing models which might be on an old school platform, or improving on existing spreadsheet models. So just going to talk a little bit about some of the reasons why companies are investing time and money to upgrade their actuarial models and some of the key benefits that brings. Have a quick introduction to Python, and then the focus will be on two case studies. So one where we moved a client's IFRS valuation process onto Python, and another one where we're doing the Solvency II asset look-through on Python. Insurance companies have a large inventory of actuarial models at this point, and this has been the result of evolving business needs over time and increased regulatory demands. And actuaries and insurance companies are looking to use new tools in order to take advantage of better data and to enhance those actuarial models and processes. I think a lot of companies have already been involved in some sort of an actuarial transformation project over the course of the past few years. For some of the benefits of enhancing actuarial models and processes, cost management is an obvious one. So if you can replace or remove or reduce the amount of repetitive manual tasks, it creates immediate value through improving the efficiency of the process and reducing time costs. Another benefit of automation is that the more you have of it, the less manual intervention and the less operational risk, which is a key target for companies. With this free time, it frees up higher value resources to do higher value work. So, it frees up more time for better analysis to be performed, better checks to be performed, and ultimately that will improve the information that's being fed to management. Maybe to go a step further than that again, I think a lot of people would have heard buzzwords and new technologies like Internet of Things, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and companies might not be able to take advantage of those new systems if they're still relying on some of the old technologies. Ability to meet demands from the regulators, certainly in Europe, companies are facing tightening Solvency II deadlines and IFRS 17 on the horizon, and that's forced companies to review their models and make sure they're fit for purpose. Access to information faster and with improved accuracy. If you have optimized models, you can do more frequent reviews and you can get better and quicker insights. And something we've seen a bit of ourselves in industry recently with COVID-19, some companies were looking to do ad hoc courses or more frequent capital monitoring. And it certainly helps to have optimized models and processes in place in order to do that. To take a look at a traditional actuarial process then, so say a reserving model calculating the solvency position of a company. A traditional actuarial process is grown quite organically over time, and a lot of companies are still using some of the old school tools. So yeah, they might have data coming through in multiple databases, maybe some data coming in Excel, text files, maybe some market data from Bloomberg. And when you have so much data coming from so many sources, you have to clean and reformat that data. So you might use another database, you might use a proprietary model reformat, or you might do some manipulation in Excel. So, lots of links, lots of manual labor, and lots of potential for operational risk. The slides are being a bit laggy, apologies for that. Maybe want to explore and check that data, you might use another database or another text file or an Excel file. As for the actual calculation engine, so say a discounted cash flow model, you might have a proprietary model, you might have an Excel model for business that hasn't been fully integrated into the main model, and in some circumstances you might have an out-of-model adjustment. In order to summarize the results, you might have another database, maybe some summary spreadsheets, you might want to check back to the original data, and then use that ultimately to drive management information or business intelligence. So it's quite easy to see how under certain circumstances, this process can become quite messy, and that's been the focus of a lot of transformation projects over the last few years. So take a look at an example of a modernized automated actuarial process, and I chose Python here as an example, but you can achieve this cleaner solution through other modeling solutions as well. Like more and more companies are looking to streamline processes so the calculations can be performed into one place where possible. So from that sense, Python is a very powerful tool for actuaries to use in the traditional actuarial process. And we'll look at an example of that in practice in the first case study. For a quick introduction to Python, it's well established at this point, and I think most people would have at least heard about it. It's described as a general purpose programming language, and what this means is it can do just about any type of calculation. I heard it described recently as the Swiss Army knife of the programming world, so it gives you an idea of the kind of functionality that it has. It's very strong on web development, so some of the big players use it, like Netflix and Instagram. This is more relevant for insurance companies, is it? It's strong on dealing with big data, data analysis, automation, and fast calculations. It's high level and concise, so it's designed in such a way that it's easy to understand the code, to interpret it, to compile it, say in comparison to some machine code. It's batteries included, so there's lots of existing functionality which gives the programmer a head start. It's relatively easy to learn, so the code length is short and the syntax is simple, and that makes it easy to write code and to understand it. It's highly extensible, so you can easily interact with other languages and software like SQL and Excel. And lastly, it's open source, and open source languages have a large number of advantages, and one of the main ones is that it's free. Anyone can go home or at home tonight, download Python on their personal laptop and run the code, study it, and modify it. And there's going to be a lot more freedom here, say, in comparison to some of the old school proprietary software that you might be familiar with. It's something we have seen the benefit of ourselves recently with COVID-19 and a lot of people working from home, that, everyone could have Python on their laptop, and, there were no restrictions around the amount of PCs could have it or anything like that. This chart just shows some of the trends in the key data science tools from 2013, and it's quite easy to see how significant the growth in Python has been, particularly over the last 5 years. Stack Overflow did a survey last year as well, and Stack Overflow is really popular amongst software developers and data scientists. And the finding of that survey was that Python is the fastest growing programming language in the world. I think around 40% of respondents used it, and it ranked fourth in terms of popularity behind JavaScript, HTML, and SQL. Again, the key benefit that this popularity brings is, the more developers there are, the more progress that there be. So you might get developments to existing libraries and maybe some new libraries developed. So it'll be really interesting to see the scale of the progress and developments over the next few years. So have a look at the first case study then, so where we moved the client's IFRS valuation process onto Python. So we assessed the client's previous process and looked for ways to automate that. The previous process itself, there was a discounted cash flow model, and that was on one of the old school proprietary models. There was an Access database, and that was used to manipulate the results, and then lots of manual work done in Excel. All in all, it took about 4 days to do the monthly valuation. So as I said, very manual and time consuming. So we looked at Python then as a solution, mainly for the reasons that I've talked about so far, and that it's open source, it's free, it's capable of doing the full end-to-end, and it was generally a good fit for the business. There was 8 key steps involved in the migration. The first one was to build the data file. Second one was to build a product feature spreadsheet, so it was for unit-linked business, and this had things like administration fee, fund commission, load-ins at a product level. We then built the assumption tables, which fed into the discounted cash flow model. We then did single policy testing, so we identified 10 different single policies, and those were selected as they were representative of the different product groupings. Once that reconciled to the original model, we scaled it up for the full products and then ultimately the full business. So that's the discounted cash flow model element. We then built the output process, so replacing Access and Excel work. We then documented the work and implemented a version control, and then lastly, model sign-off. So in the next 2 slides, I'm going to go through some of the key components in more detail. I'll say a disclaimer that it's a bit more technical, and I appreciate that everyone won't be interested in it, but I'll try to go through them quickly. As I said, the data file is the first key milestone in the migration, and the data file was built in Jupyter Notebook, and Jupyter Notebook is an IDE on Python, an integrated development environment, and this is where you write code, you test it, and you debug it. As I said, Python has lots of existing functionality, and there's lots of different libraries that you can take advantage of. I've included a list of some of these that we use for the data file. So we use Pandas to create a data frame, and this had all the policyholder data, so 300,000 rows and 200 columns. And Pandas is a real powerful tool for this type of work, and that has the combined functionality of Excel, Access, and some other models that you might have used. We use NumPy for numerical calculations, and we use Parquet, and Parquet's really useful for dealing with large data sets, in that it massively reduces the size of the file. So the original model point file was around 250 megabytes, and that reduced to 25 megabytes using Parquet. So really useful if you're saving large files down on your servers. Some other key features: the data file loads almost instantaneously, which is impressive given the size of the file. We built in an audit trail to the notebook, so it keeps a record of everything that's been done. We have integrated documentation into the notebook. So this is more from a procedural point of view, how to run the data file, what steps to do, which files to update, which file names to update. We introduced summaries and graphs into the notebook and built in automatic checks. This would have checks on the data, so nonsensical checks, so making sure the unit reserve can't be negative, making sure, the date of birth can't be after the valuation date, things like that. You could easily output it to Excel, which is useful, if you want to do any quick calculations. You can easily compare the current month with the previous month, so the summaries are useful for, checking any change in policy counts or unit reserve. And lastly, there's no hidden steps or manual intervention, so it keeps a record of everything. As for the discounted cash flow model, so the user interface was on Jupyter Notebook, which is what I went through in the previous slide. And as I said, this will have procedural documentation, so how to run the discounted cash flow model. The actual code itself is in PyCharm, which is another Python IDE. And PyCharm is useful if you're dealing with really large volumes of code. You run into issues with a lot of code using Jupyter Notebook. This code is locked down here, so what we do is if that needs to change, then that needs to go through a formal change request process. One of the key benefits of PyCharm is that it has an integrated version control. So if I go in and change the code, it keeps a record of that, keeps a record of who did it, what they changed, and when it was changed. So really good from a governance perspective. It looks a lot like other modern development environments. And as I said, this is where you run and test the code. You can examine variables, you can dig into the calculations and see how they're performed. Some other useful tools, again, these are all Python libraries. So we use Numba, which is terrific at fast calculations. Sometimes Python gets criticized by other programmers for being too slow, but Numba is very fast and it runs at roughly the same speed as C++, which is considered to be a fast language. We use Pandas again to export the results at a policy level, and we used SQLite, which is used to save down the projected cash flows for policy. So SQLite is really useful if you need to save extremely large volumes of data down. Some of the main features of the model, we now have a fully automated workflow for the valuation, so the full end-to-end on Python, right from the extracts to creating a data file, to running the discounted cash flow model, and to producing the results. The time taken to produce the monthly results, we got about a 80% reduction, so somewhere between 4 days to a half a day to 3/4 of a day. So that's the full end-to-end. As for the discounted cash flow model element, we got a similar reduction in time taken. So there wouldn't be a case study without talking about some of the pitfalls and setbacks that we faced. We initially built the model in Pandas, which I talked about. It's a Python library, and much to our disappointment, the runtimes actually increased in the original model from 1 hour to 3 hours. So we obviously weren't happy with that and had to come up with another solution. We come up with one using Numba, which is another library, and we got a massive speed up. So we found that the model could value around 3 million policies in 1 hour. So really ultra fast calculations. You can even speed that up further with the use of a GPU or multi-processing, but it's hard to envisage too many scenarios where you'd need to be improving on those runtimes. It was a fast model build, so there's 1,000 lines of code in the new model versus 8,000 in the original, and that comes back to the point that it's designed in a way that the code length is short and easy to understand. It has a very accessible data file, so over 300,000 rows. You can work quite easily with that, which would have been very difficult in Excel and Access, and that makes any future investigations, more straightforward. So if you're doing a lapse investigation or another type of experience investigation, we built in checks to the process, and we have better output in the form of new analysis. You can easily interact with other languages and software. So I mentioned SQL, which can be useful for storing data if you need to access data on SQL, and it works really well with Excel and Access. Data storage, so I mentioned that the file sizes are very small in the new model. We got a saving of up to 10 times, which is very useful if you don't want to be too much of a burden on your servers. Let's have a look at the second case study then. So it's an asset look-through performed on Python. Thought it was useful to include this just to show that when you're moving things on the Python, it doesn't always have to be large scale, big model builds and months of development, that you can automate some of the smaller tasks as well. For some background on the asset look through, for anyone that's not familiar, in the Solvency II SCR calculation, the market risk on collective investment funds require look through, so you need to assess the risk for each of the underlying assets within those funds. It can be a particularly onerous task for some companies depending on the data available and the size of the business. So the client's previous process, there was over 500 different asset files to look through and calculate the shocks to apply. It was a very manual and time-consuming process, all done in Excel, and took about 1 week to complete each quarterly valuation. As for the new process then, so there's a single Python script, took about 1 week to do the development, and the calculation now only takes 1 hour to do each quarter. I think in general, Excel isn't great for this type of work, and we've all encountered issues with large files not being fully calculated or links not being updated correctly. Python is generally a good tool for this type of work in that it can deal with large data sets, it can handle millions of rows. Its interactive nature allows you to dig into the data and identify any data issues. It has fast calculations. There's one location for the calculation, so rather than having calculations scattered over multiple files and databases, and it has better and more informative output, which makes analysis much easier. To summarize some of the benefits and challenges that we face with using Python with these models, I talked about the benefits as I worked through that, so I might just go through those quickly. The time improvements through automation. We now have greater end-to-end capabilities and fast model runtimes. Python's very strong at dealing with big data. Now have better output in the form of new analysis. Risk mitigation through automation and building in checks into the process. And it interacts very easily with other systems and software. I didn't comment a lot on some of the key challenges that we faced. So it does require a significant investment in skills. And I mentioned earlier that Python is considered to have a fast learning curve, but that's relative, and it does require significant upskilling and certainly more advanced skills in Excel. The development time could be significant depending on what's getting moved on to Python. It has a less user-friendly interface, certainly versus Excel and other software that has a dedicated front end. I think that's probably true of most open source languages. And lastly, solutions can require outside of the box thinking, and I mentioned that in the first case study where we ran into issues with runtimes and had to come up with another solution for that. Some key takeaways and lessons that we have learned through upgrading actuarial models, and this extends further than the 2 case studies that I mentioned. So in the past, companies have had to overcome technology-related anxiety, and that can be a factor for hampering success. I think a few years ago, companies might have been initially hesitant to introduce new technologies, but as they've seen their peers increasingly use these, they've naturally become more willing to adapt also. New technologies will open new doors, and we're seeing some of the large companies developing strategies that enable them to embrace automation and digital innovation. And I mentioned at the start, if companies are still relying on old school systems, that they might not be able to take advantage of these new technologies. Setbacks will occur and clever solutions are required. There will be issues that arise in projects, and it's important to allow for time to resolve those issues as they emerge. Engaging the workforce through identifying smarter and more efficient ways to work. Some people might be reluctant to change, but studies are showing that employees are more willing to embrace change and innovation, and it's a useful tool for engaging the workforce and ensuring employees are passionate about the job that they do. And something we're even seeing ourselves in interviews, that candidates are asking us what technologies we're using and what other companies are using. So it's certainly at the forefront of people's minds. And lastly, just a final slide. I talked a lot about automation and model builds, but we're also seeing clients assess other aspects of actuarial models as well, such as benchmarking to ensure best practices are applied, ensuring a strong governance and control frameworks in place, and model validation and testing. So, regardless of the system that's being used, it's always worthwhile to review models periodically to ensure that you're getting the best benefit from those. We have a brochure that goes through each of these in more detail, and I've included a link for that on the slides, which were circulated if anyone would be interested in that. And yeah, that's all from me. That's all I wanted to cover. So thanks very much for your time. And I'm going to pass back to Rob now, who's going to facilitate the Q&A.
Thanks, Eamon and Joe. And it looks to me as if I have successfully taken myself off mute, so that's one small victory. We've got a couple of questions that have come in, which I've published on the recovery plans. So before we go on to the ones that Graham has put in, I was just going to ask Eamon if, in his experience, if there's some guidelines he could give in terms of how long in elapsed time do you need to allow to prepare your recovery plan from start to finish. And it's a compound question. The second part would be how much do you rely on your actuarial modelling team to do work to include in your plan? Is there a fair degree of resource from that team required?
I think generally speaking, from our experience, we're looking at the process taking a couple of months from start to finish, from the initial identification of the scenarios that can lead to issues for the company, to the identification and refinement of the recovery options that are available. And really what sort of takes up the time then is in assessing the feasibility of the options and the impact that those options have, because they can, on a feasibility front, it can require conversations with external parties, whereas on the impact end of things, and this is to your second question around involvement of the actuarial team, the modelling around understanding the impact of various recovery options can be quite involved. Certainly can take a little bit of time to do. Then post the development of the recovery plan, there's still further work to be done, say in relation to the implementation of recovery indicators. So we can document those in the plan itself, but actually getting them up and running and into BAU then is a piece that comes after that. So I suppose to answer the question end to end, certainly 2 to 3 months, maybe up to 6 months, depending on the complexity and the options that a company is going for.
Okay, super. Go on to the next question from Graham, who was clearly channeling Donald Rumsfeld, asking about unknown unknowns. So the paraphrase of the question, which I hope everybody can see, is do we fight the last war, or do we prepare for the next one, and how do we do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are a number of things that we need to do, I suppose, in order to identify these types of scenarios. Firstly, if we look at the specific risk profile of the company and of the type of business that it writes, just to see if there's anything there that might particularly affect the company itself as opposed to the industry in general. So are there any idiosyncratic exposures there? We should also look at our own emerging risk register. So if we have a good and robust process in place on the emerging risk front, we should be able to see, well, what are the sorts of things that are featuring there, and try to match those then against the risk profile of the company to see, well, if we recognize them as emerging risks and they particularly impact some feature of the company, well, then I think there's probably a red flag there in relation to something that we really need to look at in more detail. If we have an own risk insolvency assessment that we're performing, there should be good clues in there to quite adverse scenarios that could happen, as we say, but haven't yet happened. particularly if we look at reverse stress testing. So the scenarios that can really challenge and maybe break the business model. So I would see those as maybe being the best sources of ideas around coming up with those kind of more extreme scenarios.
Super, thank you. Another question from Graham, and this particularly relates to the situation that a number of Isle of Man companies find themselves in, where they will have significant exposure to foreign exchange, either in terms of liabilities or in terms of sometimes their cost base. And how do you know if a particular FX that you have an exposure to, which moves significantly, and what might be your trigger points for considering whether that would be a permanent move or a temporary move, and it will exhibit mean reversion at some stage in the future?
Yeah, another great question. What I've been trying to do in this situation is just look at the overall volatility in the FX rate. So for how long has the rate been at this new level, either higher or lower relative to where it was? And in the past, how long has the rate sort of deviated from what we might consider to be our view of the normal FX rate, whatever that is. So if we think that there's a deviation there from the norm, well, how long has it existed? And if it's often been the case that a rate might deviate for 2 or 3 weeks, and the rate at the moment has only deviated for 2 or 3 weeks, there's nothing unusual there. But if we're now into months and it's only happened to deviate for a couple of weeks anytime in the past, then there's maybe cause for concern there. I think as well, we need to just think about whether or not there's any identifiable cause for the change in FX rates. Like as we know, FX rates can be volatile for no good reason, really, just that they just tend to jump around. Short term, maybe demand for currency or something like that. But if there's been a significant event like we've seen in the recent past, a Brexit, for example, maybe a currency speculation against the euro back when there was talk of potential Eurozone breakup. If there's been any significant change in central bank policy, maybe around the level of inflation, maybe that they might be targeting, which would have a knock-on effect on long-term FX rates. So if there's an identifiable cause there, I suppose it maybe does indicate that we're not in a situation where it's just a kind of a temporary blip in rates and that we could reasonably expect them to bounce back. So I think once FX rates move anyway, a little bit beyond your comfort zone, it's certainly no harm to kind of have the finger on the trigger, dust down the recovery plan and just have a look at what option you are planning to pursue. Make sure there aren't any new impediments there to pursuing that. And you can then step back from it if you see FX rates reverting to the norm.
Super, thank you. We'll move on now to a couple of questions on the actuarial modelling, and Danny submitted one, and I'm wondering whether teams could implement a 140 character limit on questions like Twitter. Not sure whether that would be a good idea or a bad idea, but however, Danny's asking about why bespoke models now? What's changed that we think it's a good time to develop them? And before I hand over to Joe, I would throw in my 2 pennies worth in saying, I think that over time, lots of actuarial processes and actuarial modeling processes have become more complex, and particularly with lots of manual steps in between. So you chain lots of spreadsheets together. You take spreadsheet A and output it to spreadsheet B, combine it with the output of spreadsheet C and put it into spreadsheet D. And that involves, it's sometimes things like that are difficult to document and involve lots of knowledge within your staff, and manual processes are prone to error. One of the things that I've taken from the stuff that Joe has said is that using these frameworks, and got Python, we've got our own internal, we've got our own products like Milliman Mind, can enable you to chain those processes together. So there isn't the opportunity there isn't a requirement for manual intervention and the opportunity for mistakes to be made. But I'm sure Joe has a couple of other points to make on that question as well.
Yeah, I think that's all very true, Rob. And the key benefit is automation and being able to do the full end-to-end, in one place where possible. Maybe if I add a bit to it and say, if I compare Python to proprietary software and take the question that way, I think a few years ago, proprietary software probably had the edge and Python was at a very immature stage. The proprietary software was robust, it was well known, there was people that had the skills, actuaries had the skills to model it. I think with Python having a much bigger user base, it's meant more developments, and it's meant Python possibly now has more capabilities. And I think the only real advantages that I can think of other systems having the edge over Python is that they're well known and trusted in the actuarial field, and Python is the new kid on the block. I think Python, as I said, now has lots of other advantages, and the main piece being that it's relatively easy to learn. The output is better, the documentation is easier and more straightforward. There's no licensing fees. And the automation aspect is something is one of the main drivers why companies are looking to adapt this technology.
Okay, thank you. And then one other question from Danny, which to summarize is basically what can we do to make sure that we don't deliver a black box to our client when we're working on one of these systems, and that we embed the model and the process back into them?
I think it's just around documentation. So making sure the model is well documented, the procedure documents are well documented, we can give training to the clients where possible and get as many people within the company, used to Python. And as I said, it doesn't have to be full model builds. If there's any small tasks in companies that can get maybe some of the junior staff, get them upskilled in Python, then, that's a good starting point from them, but then they'll be able to use their skills in order to, to develop more superior models and avoid having this issue of a black box.
I think the other point on that is that it can be quite client specific as well. Some smaller clients might actually want their external consultant to maintain ownership of the model, so to be responsible for development, maintenance and running of the model over time. Whereas a bigger client that has a big actuarial shop, so to speak, would push up the integration of that model back, or the handover back to their internal processes much higher in the mix of things. That was more of a statement than a question. Okay, I'm just looking at the Q&A feed to see if there's anything else come in. There isn't, so I think we're going to, unless anyone else has any burning final questions and they're furiously typing them at me, we'll wrap it up in a minute or so. I just have one thing in from, I'm not sure whether it is Tom or Jonathan as the two Manx Actuarial Society council representatives, but they're saying that the MAS are looking to restart the CPD sessions in the near future once everything is people are back, the offices are open again, and it's fully safe to do so. So that will be starting up. So stay tuned, and Jonathan will be in touch. And then one final question. Oh, hang on, I'll just publish this so everybody can see it. Can you use it for data validation only to feed into a different projection model? In other words, pick what you want instead of the whole thing. Over to Joe.
Yeah, sorry, I was just reading the question there. Yeah, so absolutely, like what we're seeing is a lot of companies only use it for a subset of their process. So they might say have a proprietary model for the discounted cash flow model, but back end or front end that with Python. So that's absolutely the case that you can integrate it into smaller parts of the process also.
Okay, great. I think we shall double check before I finish off. Yep, we'll wrap it up at 6 minutes past 1. Thank you very much for your attendance. I hope you found it useful. Feel free to come back to me personally to give any feedback, or if you have any other topics for future sessions, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.